Hello and welcome to our second episode of Crystalcast. My name is Ross and I'm an immigration lawyer based in Sydney. Thank you very much for tuning in, and a big thank you for the overwhelming positive response that we had on episode 1. I'm glad that you've enjoyed it, you found it useful, and thank you so much for sending across your feedback, your questions. If you want to be featured on one of our episodes, feel free to send us an email, ross@crystalmigration.net, or get in contact with us using the details below. Now, there's a lot to discuss in this particular episode. I want to talk about the latest news that's been happening in immigration. We've got our question of the week, our topic of the week, and I also want to talk about some of the feel-good things that have been happening in immigration. Stay tuned and let's get this podcast started. And now let's talk about immigration news. A lot has been happening in the world of migration. The prominent one being the 408 visa being phased out, with the first stage implemented last week. As of this week, it is no longer possible for someone who is a non-408 visa holder in a pandemic stream to lodge a subsequent 408 application. And for the new 408 applicants, the maximum period that the 408 visa in a pandemic stream can be granted for would be 6 months. Now, this news was part of the government's long-term strategy in terms of phasing out any COVID concessions and returning to what we now know as the post-COVID normal. Now, in addition to that, Migration Queensland has released their nomination criteria for subclass 190 visas and also subclass 491 visas. Now, there are some considerable differences between what was happening with Queensland last year by comparison to what is happening with Migration Queensland's nominations this year. First, we only have 1,550 allocations, so that's quite a significant decrease. And the reason for that is because there's quite a large number of applications that the Department of Home Affairs is currently processing. Now, let's talk about the different criteria. So in terms of the subclass 190 visa, you've got what's called the general criteria. So if your occupation falls within a non-trade occupation, the minimum score would be 75 points, and if the occupation falls within a trades occupation, that has been moved down to 70 points. In addition to that, the level of English would be competent or higher. However, you do need to look at the occupation list because certain occupations would have a high level of English. Full-time employment has been adjusted to 30 hours per week, and evidence of full-time employment needs to be presented at the time of lodging a state nomination, and in addition to that, the applicant must have been living in Queensland for at least 2 years by the time of the visa approval. So that's really important to understand, because if you are living in a different state, New South Wales or South Australia or any other state or territory, it will not be possible for you to lodge the application in the general stream. Now, moving on to the 491 general stream criteria, the points cutoff is 65 points or higher. English language remains at competent. Evidence of living in regional area, that is outside of Brisbane. So Gold Coast, for example, would be acceptable, and Far North Queensland. Now, the full-time employment is reduced to 6 months. And in addition to that, it's 30 hours per week and must be living in Queensland regional area for at least 3 years. You also have a graduate criteria. So graduate criteria existed last year, and that has continued to be implemented or continue to be in place for this financial year. Now, the points cutoff is 75 points for the 190 visa and 65 points for the 491 visa. Now, in terms of the type of occupation that your client would be eligible for, or if you're a visa applicant, it will depend on what type of qualification you've completed. So if you've completed a master's degree, there will be more occupations available to you. If you complete a bachelor's degree, there will be fewer occupations available. But what's important to remember is that you must have graduated in the past 2 calendar years, and in addition to that, 100% of your studies must have been completed in Queensland. So for those that are studying interstate and or doing online study, unless the person is present in Queensland or physically present in Queensland, they would not be eligible. And last but not least, the small business owner subclass 491 stream remains, and there are 2 different pathways. One for pre-existing business, that is a business that's been operating for at least 2 years, and you've also got startup businesses as well. Now, the major difference between the two is the investment amount, the established business being $100,000, whereas a startup being $200,000. And in addition to that, the established business must also generate at least 1 job. Now, this criteria, it's fairly broad, and it is fairly diverse in terms of the types of applicants that would be attracted to applying for Queensland state migration. But again, keeping in mind that there's only 1,500 places available, it will be quite a fierce competition. Our question of the week is, when will I receive my invitation? Now, when this question is asked, this question relates to your general skilled migration category visas, so your subclass 189, 190, and 491 visas. Now, the question is somewhat controversial because it's not simple as saying you will receive the invitation quicker if you are on extra points. The way that invitations work is the expressions of interest are lodged first and then they are ranked. So let me explain the process in a bit more detail. For example, let's say that the government decides to issue 1,000 invitations in this invitation round. And out of those 1,000 places, 10 places are allocated towards the occupation of developer programmer. So what that means is that the person on the highest number of points and the person who has lodged their expression of interest first will receive the invitation. And this continues to trickle down until all 10 places are used up. Now, whoever sits at place number 11 will then stay in the expression of interest pool and may be invited in the next invitation round. So the reason why that's important to understand the ranking system is because the ranking system tends to change. For example, someone might have turned 45 today, which means that they are no longer eligible to receive an invitation. Someone might have received permanent residence visa of another kind, so they will no longer be eligible to participate in this program, or maybe someone has withdrawn their expression of interest. So therefore, when, say for example, you've got a colleague or you've got a friend or you've got a client and they received an invitation on 75 points, it doesn't mean that someone in the same occupation will also receive the invitation at the same time. So the reason why there's that discrepancy is because of the ranking. And because the ranking changes and it's a live system, it's impossible to predict when you will receive the invitation. Do the points influence the invitation rounds? They absolutely do. But just because someone is sitting on 100 points, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will receive the invitation faster. And the reason for that is because there might be 50 or 70 or even 100 people sitting on the same score. So therefore, the competition for this particular round might be slightly higher by comparison to competition in the next invitation round. So what can you do in order to increase your chances of receiving an invitation? Well, first and foremost, understand how many points you hold and ensure that all of your documents are available. So therefore, if you are claiming superior English, you must have a valid English language certificate of IELTS 8 equivalent. And now for this week's emails. Thank you very much for writing to us. This week we received an email from Gary, and Gary writes, "Hi Ross, congratulations to Crystal Migration and yourself on an excellent newsletter and podcast, particularly for someone like myself who is currently in South Africa, my second home. Like many, I was somewhat surprised at a relatively small number of recently allocated 491 and 190 applications, but I see, like with BIP, this is due to backlog of existing applications with the department. Also, like with BIP, this could change as we head deeper into the migration year with low BIP planning levels. I can't see this changing for the latter visas. All of this, of course, makes it a bit difficult to do much forward planning and promotions, but hopefully the government's migration strategy will finally be released this year." Thank you so much, Gary, and I completely agree with you. It does make it somewhat difficult, and I suppose my comments here is, we want to be able to instill that consumer confidence and instill confidence that doing skills assessments, investing into Australian economy will result in receiving a visa, and that can be challenging and somewhat defeating as well when you see smaller allocations. If you want your email or your comments to be featured on this podcast, email ross@crystalmigration.net. Now, this week's feel-good topic is an AAT case for a distinguished talent visa. I'll give a little bit of background. Now, distinguished talent visa is different to global talent visa. It's the same visa subclass, but the criteria is different. Essentially, someone needs to be exceptionally prominent in the area of arts or academia or research or sports, and they need to also demonstrate that they would be bringing an exceptional economic benefit to Australia. Now, this particular client, and they've given us permission to use his story, I should say, has applied for a distinguished talent visa, and he is a double bass player. Now, I am not a musical instrument type of person, but I have done distinguished talent visas for musicians in the past. Now, the unfortunate case with this particular applicant was the fact that when the application was put through, the way that the application was put together read to me more like an application for a skilled visa. For example, when his resume was submitted to the Department of Home Affairs, it simply listed the types of freelance gigs that he did, and also it listed the types of concerts that he has played in. Now, if you're like me, and you may not necessarily know what a double bass player would do, it does become a little bit difficult to assess whether someone is prominent. So when you approach distinguished talent visas, it's important to understand who your audience is. And the way that I look at it is that, well, I assume that my audience don't understand or don't know what the distinguished talent involves. Now, that's not to patronize anyone, but that's the approach that you need to take because we all have different interests. So when this applicant came to us, they were quite defeated. The visa was refused, but it was very evident to us that we could salvage that application if it was explained properly to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal what the applicant does. Now, he came to us last year in October, and the first thing that I did, I sat down with him and he spoke to me about, well, what he does as a double bass player, what that involves, and why it's important to mention the types of concerts and the types of competitions that he has included in the application. So, for example, as a double bass player, there's actually not a lot of them in Australia, and this particular applicant is situated in South Australia, and they are quite rare. So, for example, if you go into a competition, you generally go as a group, and he was performing solo, and that's quite a big deal because that in itself shows prominence. Now, during the hearing, which happened early this week on Monday, we had a member, and the member made it very clear that they were not across musical instruments, but they were very happy to hear what made this particular applicant prominent. And that's important. So that's what I was talking about earlier. Assume that your audience doesn't know where the talent lies. So the applicant was able to explain the nature of double bass playing, the fact that he's traveled to a number of different countries, Germany, London, UK, I should say. He's played in New Zealand before, and he's done a number of gigs across Australia as well. And I suppose the other issue that arose is the fact that all of that talent that we spoke about, well, a lot of it was squashed during COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you're in Australia, most of Australia was under lockdown of some sort. And it was very difficult if you were in the field of entertainment to be able to carry on those gigs. So it does become quite difficult and challenging to evidence your prominence and maintain your prominence when you're not allowed to perform. But luckily for this particular individual, he was still able to perform at smaller gigs, and he was able to demonstrate invitations, and this is where it's important, to events that were cancelled as a result of COVID-19. He also walked the tribunal through his musical career. He talked about how he got into the field of music, and he talked about the accelerated program that he went through. And there's only about 300 visas, 300 distinguished talent visas that are granted per year. So therefore, it does remain to be one of probably the most refused visa applications that you can lodge, because we can have a talent, but that talent may not necessarily translate to two things that Department of Home Affairs looks at, and that is international prominence and recognition. And the second part is employability, because you need to be able to demonstrate that the talent that you possess will come into fruition and you would be able to make a living out of it. So the member made it very clear that she was satisfied with the fact that our client did have the talent, that the talent was prominent. She made a very important note about the submissions and the fact that they helped her to understand this particular talent. So even though the member doesn't come from a musical background, the submissions and the evidence was very important in allowing her to direct her state of mind to the type of work that my client does. And the aspect in relation to employability was able to be demonstrated by the number of bookings that we were able to provide, and they go all the way to December of this year and beyond. Now, the hearing lasted for only 50 minutes, and at the end of the hearing, the member said that she was satisfied that this applicant was, in fact, an applicant who qualifies for a distinguished talent visa. He was able to demonstrate that his talent is distinguished and recognized amongst his peers, that he's got international proven track record in his field, and most importantly, that he is employable and he continues to stay prominent. And the member directed this particular case to be remitted back to the Department of Home Affairs for reconsideration, with the direction to approve the application. So definitely a good outcome for our client, and a good sense in terms of how these applications are assessed. So if you are dealing with a distinguished talent visa, a couple of notes to take away here. The first one is understanding that there needs to be international prominence, that there's a very low quota that's allocated for these visas, 300 per year, and the applicant must continue to demonstrate that international prominence throughout the application process. This week in non-migration related news, what I wanted to talk today about is something a little bit different, and that is, how do we approach a difficult task? Now, whether you are a migration agent, an immigration lawyer, or a visa applicant applying for a visa, all of us go through a period where we may not want to do a particular task. We may find a particular task daunting, maybe a little bit scary, or maybe we're just procrastinating. I often face situations where a particular task comes my way and I may not want to do it, whether it's difficult, whether it's just something that's a bit mundane, or whether it's something that requires a lot of time that I may not necessarily have. Now, difficult tasks only become difficult if you view it as a complex situation. Now, the way to tackle a difficult task, or what's worked for me, is to allow those tasks to become part of your routine. Now, the first thing to figure out is whether you're a morning person or whether you're a night person. Now, that's important because our brain chemistry works in different ways, and not the same approach is going to work for one person that works for another person. So the first thing to identify is, when do you tend to be better at solving complex problems? For me, I have a routine of getting up very early in the morning. I wake up at 5 a.m. And the reason why I get up early in the morning is because my brain is clear. I have had a good night's sleep. I try to get 7 hours per day. And I'm at the point of where there is no background noise. The phones are not ringing. I haven't checked my emails. So if there's a difficult task at hand, I leave it to the first thing in the morning. And I set a particular time aside. So whether it's 1 hour, or whether it's 2 hours, or whether it's even 20 minutes, because the important thing to note here is that what you're doing is you're putting time aside to deal with a task that you don't want to deal. So if you're a migration professional, that might be drafting a submission, or maybe looking at a complex visa application, or providing a complex advice. Now, if you're a visa applicant, you might be putting together your relationship statement for your partner visas. So putting aside just a little bit of time, doesn't matter whether it's 1 hour, 2 hours, but having that downtime to be able to switch off and focus on that task at hand. And what you will find is, if you set that time aside and you practice that routine consistently, that notion of having to deal with a difficult task will no longer become a notion of a difficult task. It will become a routine or a habit where you're doing productive work. So when you're dealing with the difficult tasks, my tip would be to ensure that there's no background noise. Now, background noise for me is anything that would distract me. My emails, TV, telephone, you want that out of the way. Make sure that you've got quiet space to work in, and make sure that you are not available to anyone else during that time. Now, there was a very interesting study that was done, and that's something that I've taken away and I have implemented that into my routine. The maximum amount of time that a human brain can concentrate at an optimum level is about 40 minutes, give or take. Now, what happens when we get interrupted, whether that's a telephone call, or, children screaming in the background, or your partner asking you a question? Once we get interrupted, it takes equal amount of time, around 40 minutes, to get back to that optimum level. So the reason why tasks become difficult is because the environment that you surround yourself in may not be appropriate. So if you're constantly being interrupted, if you're constantly being distracted by other things, the task becomes difficult because your brain is unable to maintain that focus that it needs in order to complete the task. So my tip of the week in terms of completing difficult tasks at hand is to create a routine, set aside some time, whether it's in the morning or at nighttime or during the day, have some quiet space, and make sure that that is your downtime, meaning that you are not contactable and you're able to focus on the work. If you try that for a couple of weeks, you will soon realize that those difficult tasks that we always put on the back burner will become much easier. That's all that we have time for today. Thank you very much for listening. Like and subscribe to our podcast to get the latest updates. If you want to be featured on our podcast, send us an email and we will make it happen. And if there's any particular content or topic that you want me to cover, you can also send me an email or leave your details, and I will be able to get in touch with you, and we will ensure that we provide the content that continues to stay relevant, that is interesting, and that is engaging. Thank you very much, and I will see you at our next episode.